John F. Kennedy has become a part of American mythology at this point. No matter what political ideology you have as an American, more than likely you hold John F. Kennedy in some high regard, despite having very little to no knowledge of his foreign or domestic policies. But people, including Democrats and quote unquote leftists, hold Kennedy in regard and consider his assassination and the conspiracies that revolve around his assassination the beginning of the end for American liberals and the rise of fascism in the United States, as the late comedian Bill Hicks put it in one of his stand up routines. In actual reality, John F. Kennedy and his administration were, like all United States presidents, in the pocket of corporations and corporate interests, and acted foreignly and domestically in corporate interest and corporate favor, whether it was in Cuba, Iran, Vietnam, or here at home. The Kennedy administration is another in a long line of U.S. presidential administrations who fought for the corporate sector and ignored the majority of the needs of the American people. We're going to start this video off by talking about foreign policy, as we usually do with presidents, and by the end of it, we will discuss the conspiracy theories around his assassination. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is anything but casual. Let's talk first about the Kennedy administration and the Vietnam War. Although Kennedy didn't start the Vietnam War, his administration laid much of the groundwork for the intense U.S. military involvement that followed. While he publicly expressed doubts about U.S. success in the region, Kennedy doubled down on military aid and advisory personnel, raising the number of American advisors. If you haven't watched my Vietnam video, I highly suggest you go back and watch it. But advisors were soldiers actively involved in military intervention in Vietnam who were not called soldiers or generals because they did not want to be actively in Vietnam until they were fully ready to assess the situation. These advisors were raised from 900 under Eisenhower to about 16,000 by the time of his assassination in 1963. One of the darker legacies of this escalation was the increased use of napalm and aerial bombardments. Under Kennedy, the U.S. supported the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, operations that included napalm strikes, meaning the United States had planes sent to the ARVN and painted the ARVN logo on them, and then used U.S. pilots in these planes to bomb the hell out of Vietnam. Though the worst images of napalm would come later, JFK's administration oversaw its introduction as a tactic of psychological and physical warfare. Chemical warfare also took root during this time, particularly during the approval of herbicide programs like Operation Ranch Hand, which began under JFK in 1962. This initiative aimed to destroy rural vegetation, crops suspected of supporting Viet Cong forces, Viet Cong once again being the term the United States created for the National Liberation Front, marking the start of large-scale defoliation campaigns. If you don't know what that means, the United States was supporting and doing the destruction of agriculture so people could not grow crops to feed themselves, as was the main way of feeding and supporting themselves in the communities of Vietnam. The most infamous chemical used, Agent Orange, was deployed under this program, and its long-term health and environmental effects remain devastating to this day. In short, while Kennedy often spoke of containing communism and protecting democracy, his administration normalized many of the brutal tactics that would later define the war, leaving a legacy of militarized escalation and chemical warfare that deeply shaped U.S. conduct in Vietnam. From there, we can discuss the Kennedy administration's influence in Indonesia and East Timor, which would be the closest thing to genocide of the 21st century after the Holocaust. The U.S. relationship with Indonesia under JFK helped lay the geopolitical and military foundation for the genocide and the war crimes that were to come. In the early 1960s, Indonesia was under the leadership of President Sudarno, a left-leaning nationalist who was viewed warily by U.S. for his non-alignment in the Cold War and his growing ties to the Communist Party of Indonesia. JFK, seeking to keep Indonesia from aligning with China or the USSR, made this a priority. Instead of confronting the Indonesian government directly, JFK doubled military and economic aid to Indonesia. In 1962, he backed Sukarno's campaign to annex West Papua, pressuring the Dutch into ceding the territory to the Indonesia despite Papuan resistance. This set a precedent for Indonesian territorial expansion, a policy of forced integration that would later be replicated in East Timor. JFK's support also legitimized the Indonesian military as a key actor in domestic and regional politics. U.S. training and funding helped professionalize and empower a military that would later seize control in a brutal coup in 1965 following JFK's death. That military, under Suharto, would go on to invade East Timor in 1975, committing a genocide that killed over 200,000 Timorese and nearly a third of the population. While Kennedy didn't order the invasion or directly support East Timor's occupation, his administration's support for the Indonesian military, quiet acceptance of Papuan annexation, and Cold War realpolitik helped set the stage for the atrocities that followed. Moving on from there to Iran. The Kennedy administration inherited a deeply entrenched U.S.-Iran relationship that followed the 1953 CIA-backed coup that overthrew democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Masada and reinstalled Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. This coup, carried out under Eisenhower, left Iran under increasingly authoritarian rule, while growing resentment among ordinary Iranians grew. I want to make this point real fast, because when we talk about the CIA, as we will talk about with the Bay of Pigs and with Kennedy's assassination, the CIA has never done anything that was not directly approved by the United States or that the president administration of that time did not know about. So anytime you hear about these conspiracy theories or think about the CIA, the TSA, or the FBI as rogue government entities, it is incredibly false and ludicrous. The CIA, the FBI, the TSA, and any other United States military entity or intelligence entity gets its orders directly from the White House, and the White House knows what they are doing at all times. While Kennedy did not attempt to undo this relationship, his administration took a more reformist tone than his predecessors, pressuring the Shah behind closed doors to implement land reform, education programs, and basic civil liberties as a part of what came to be known as the White Revolution. The U.S. hoped this would stem the tide of leftist and Islamist opposition movements brewing under the surface, while preserving Iran as a strategic Cold War ally. However, these reforms, while seemingly progressive on paper, were top-down, rushed, and repressive in practice. Land reform displaced traditional landowners without empowering peasants. Educational reforms centralized state control, and dissent was silenced through SAVAK, the Shah's brutal intelligence agency, armed and trained with U.S. support. JFK's pressure may have accelerated these changes, but they deepened social unrest, especially among the religious opposition that would later culminate in the 1979 revolution. Kennedy's strategy in Iran reflected his broader Cold War playbook: support friendly authoritarian regimes, but nudge them towards modernization to preempt revolution. In practice, this created instability and alienated wide swaths of the Iranian population, further entrenching anti-American sentiment. Now let's go ahead and talk about Cuba. We're going to talk about it pre-missile crisis and pre-Bay of Pigs, and we're going to discuss that as we get to the end, and then after this section, we'll discuss the missile crisis. When Fidel Castro overthrew U.S.-backed dictator Batista in 1959, the Eisenhower administration quickly grew hostile toward the new revolutionary government. Especially Castro nationalized American businesses, implemented sweeping agrarian reforms, and aligned more closely with the Soviet Union. By the time JFK took office in 1961, the CIA had already planned and begun training a force of Cuban exiles to invade the island and spark a popular uprising. Once again, that was started under the Eisenhower administration, and then Kennedy was briefed on this plan just days into his presidency, and despite misgivings, which were very minor, approved the invasion, and hoping a swift, covert operation would avoid the appearance of direct U.S. involvement. The Bay of Pigs invasion, launched in April 1961, was a total disaster. The 1,400 CIA-trained exiles were quickly overwhelmed by Cuban forces, and no popular uprising materialized. Worse, the world quickly realized the U.S. was behind the attack, dealing JFK a massive foreign policy embarrassment in his first 100 days. The aftermath had far-reaching consequences. It cemented Castro's alliance with the USSR, leading him to formally declare Cuba a socialist state. Specifically, because Castro realized that Cuba alone was not going to be able to protect itself from the United States, it had to find a military partner to protect it, and there was only one at the time who could protect it, and that was the USSR. The United States drove Cuba to the USSR. Cuba itself wanted to be independent of all nations by itself, completely autonomous. but the United States' actions drove Cuba to need protection from somewhere that had nuclear arms, and the only one that was available at the time was the USSR. This also accelerated internal crackdowns within Cuba, as the regime used the failed invasion to justify repression of dissent. It humiliated JFK and made him more determined not to appear weak in future confrontations, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. Despite the failure, JFK continued covert operations to undermine Castro's regime, authorizing Operation Mongoose, a series of sabotage efforts and assassination plots carried out throughout his presidency. While often remembered as a charismatic idealist, JFK's Cuba policy was deeply entangled with Cold War interventionism, laying the groundwork for one of the most dangerous moments in human history a year later. Now, here are some of the specifics of the covert operations in Cuba pre- and post-Bay of Pigs. Pre-Bay of Pigs, CIA planning under Eisenhower of the Bay of Pigs. Like I said, it started with Eisenhower, and the training of the anti-Castro Cuban exiles started in 1960 in Guatemala and Nicaragua. JFK approved with changes to the plan, but scaled it down to make it appear less U.S.-led, even though pretty clearly it was going to be known that it was going to be U.S.-led, and the world pretty much almost immediately realized this. Specifics about the Bay of Pigs invasion, April 17th to April 20th, 1961. The invasion forced about 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles, calling them Brigade 2506, landed at Pueyrredon and Playa Larga on the southern coast of Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. Airstrikes go wrong. Prior to the landing, the CIA launched pre-invasion airstrikes in Cuban airfields, meant to neutralize the Cuban Air Force. However, JFK canceled the second planned round of air support, leaving invaders exposed to Cuban aircraft still in operation. So, among other things we can talk about JFK, he also was real cold feet about this whole thing because he got scared of the world's reaction to it and also not knowing how it was going to go down. And so he also let his own people, these Cuban exiles who were thinking we're fully backed by the United States government, to be total lambs to slaughter and left out to dry. The Cuban military response mobilized 20,000 Cuban troops surrounding the invaders, while airstrikes completely destroyed supply ships and pinned the brigade on the beach. No uprising happened whatsoever. The anticipated anti-Castro rebellion never materialized. Most Cubans did not rise up to support the invaders, and many remained loyal to the revolution or suspicious of U.S. intentions. Cubans were very supportive of the revolution because they had gone through slavery under the Spanish and then slavery under the United States. Why in the world the United States had any thought that Cuban peasants or Cuban normalized society would support exiles, who were the people who made money off of the capitalist regimes exploiting Cuba in the first place, makes no sense to me, and it is completely baffling, and it led to almost the end of the world, as we'll talk about. The outcome of this was, after 3 days of fighting, nearly all the exiles were captured or killed. 1,100 were taken prisoner, later ransomed by the U.S. for food and medical supplies worth about $53 million. Post-Bay of Pigs, we're going to talk about now Operation Mongoose. After the Bay of Pigs debacle, JFK authorized this operation, ran by CIA under General Edward Lancel, with the goal of destabilizing or overthrowing the Castro government through sabotage missions, blowing up factories, power plants, and crops. This is what we would describe, if it happened here in the United States or to one of our allies, terrorism. The United States under JFK strictly implemented just straight terrorism in Cuba. Psychological warfare to stir rebellion, which also failed, and multiple assassination attempts on Castro that have been pretty well documented at this point. Once again, and I cannot express this enough, the Kennedy administration implemented terrorist tendencies in Vietnam and Cuba, but in Cuba specifically, these tendencies pushed Cuba to the USSR because they needed protection, which then led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we will now talk to, October 1962. After the Bay of Pigs and Operation Mongoose, the U.S. made it abundantly clear it wanted regime change in Cuba. This included repeated sabotage missions, assassination attempts, and military exercises near Cuba. The USSR under Khrushchev, saw an opportunity. By placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, the Soviets could deter further U.S. aggression against Cuba, who were now their ally, who were allied with the Soviet Union, once again specifically to defend themselves against the United States, and offset U.S. nuclear superiority since the U.S. had short and medium-range missiles in Turkey, Italy, and the UK, weapons capable of striking Soviet territory in minutes. On October 14, 1962, a spy plane captured images of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. JFK was briefed the next morning. Over the next week, known as the 13 Days, the Kennedy administration debated military action versus diplomatic measures. The U.S. chose to impose a naval quarantine around Cuba on October 22nd, framing it as a defensive action, even though blockades are typically considered acts of war under international law, and once again, defensive action after the United States had imposed all of these different acts of terrorism on Cuba, which we've just discussed. The Jupiter missiles and broken agreements. This is a very fun little tidbit. Noam Chomsky highlights in Who Rules the World. The U.S. agreed informally with the USSR to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy as a part of the resolution at the end of the 13 days with Russia, but only if the agreement was kept secret. What is more deceptive about this is that the U.S. had already planned to decommission the older Jupiter missiles in Turkey, deemed obsolete, but chose to leave newer missile systems in place, violating the spirit of the deal. While the public narrative was that Khrushchev backed down and JFK triumphed, the reality was both sides compromised, but only the Soviets held their side publicly. And this needs to be really firmly stated. The United States simply replaced older missiles with newer missiles in Turkey, violating their agreement with Russia. Had Russia found out about this, we would have been back to moments before the end of the world. The United States has done this several times through history, but the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crises were almost the American government, John F. Kennedy's administration, acting as aggressors that almost ended the entire human race. That being said, here are some misconceptions about the crisis. The U.S. framed the missile placement in Cuba as sudden provocation, but this ignored the fact that the U.S. had dozens of nuclear weapons stationed near Soviet borders, as well as the aggressions against Cuba, as we've discussed. The crisis nearly escalated into nuclear war on several occasions. One lesser moment, on October 27th, a U.S. U-2 was shot down over Cuba, and another incident nearly led a Soviet submarine commander to launch a nuclear torpedo, stopped only by Archibald's refusal to approve the order. Many historians now agree the United States created the conditions that made the crisis possible through Cold War posturing, aggression toward Cuba, and its surrounding of the USSR with offensive weapons. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba and in a secret side deal agreed to withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. We just discussed that. It was a total lie, and they withdrew older missiles they considered obsolete and replaced them with newer ones. JFK maintained the image of victory, but Cuba remained on the U.S. hit list, and covert operations continued under Operation Mongoose even after the crisis ended. Brief summary. The Cuban Missile Crisis was simply a heroic moment of American restraint. It was a result of aggressive U.S. policy towards Cuba, dangerous Cold War escalation by surrounding the USSR and nuclear weapons, and deliberate U.S. deception. All of this happened under the Kennedy administration. Now moving on to domestic policy, we talk about Robert Kennedy and COINTELPRO. Robert F. Kennedy approved the expansion of surveillance and covert operations against groups the FBI deemed subversive, including civil rights leaders, socialist and community organizers, black activists, and anti-war voices. And although JFK and RFK are often remembered for their late in the game civil rights, they sanctioned surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., including wiretaps and psychological harassment. If you want to know more about that, there's a video on this channel about COINTELPRO, about the harassment of Martin Luther King Jr., and the assassination of Fred Hampton as well. In 1963, Robert F. Kennedy personally signed off on the wiretapping of Dr. King after Hoover alleged ties, Hoover was the head of the FBI at the time, alleged ties between King's circle and communists, despite these claims being flimsy and politically motivated. These actions weren't rogue FBI maneuvers. Once again, all of this stuff happens under White House watch. They were fully authorized by the levels of the Kennedy administration. So while publicly and softly the Kennedy administration were for and pro-civil rights, privately they sought to undermine them, and even with the FBI and Kennedy administration tried to get Martin Luther King Jr. to kill himself or be assassinated through other means. I've talked about that to a great extent on this channel, so that's all I'm going to be talking about here. But JFK with civil rights, we'll discuss briefly. He's often praised for getting civil rights more rate, but privately, he really was skeptical of the civil rights movement's tactics, especially nonviolent direct action and the frequent public disruption it created. They viewed Martin Luther King Jr. as a liability, especially due to supposed communist ties, which led to the RFK Jr. approved wiretaps and the expansion of COINTELPRO. JFK privately urged civil rights leaders to tone down demonstrations, fearing they would alienate moderate rights and disrupt international perceptions of U.S. democracy, which, for people of color and people who were taking place in civil rights movement actions, they had no democracy for them whatsoever at this point in time. As Noam Chomsky and others have pointed out, the administration was more committed to preserving stability than to ending systematic racism or promoting civil rights. Very briefly, labor policy here in the United States, campaigned for labor in his campaign, but his administration was moderate and business friendly. He did not expand union rights and often prioritized keeping labor peace over empowering workers. His administration clashed with steelworkers union in 1962, trying to control inflation more than backing workers by accusing the U.S. Steel of price gouging. The unemployment remained high in many sectors, especially for Black Americans, and there was little structural change. Economic policy was heavily influenced by Keynesians like Walter Heller, focused on stimulating demand through tax cuts and government spending. If you're wondering where tax cuts and government spending have been heard before, it was through the Reagan administration. A proposed massive tax cut that would benefit the wealthy corporations was pushed through by LBJ in 1964, but was written by the Kennedy administration. And the economy did grow during his presidency, but inequality remained untouched, and growth relied heavily on military spending and Cold War expansionism. Bottom line, the Kennedy administration stabilized post-recession growth, but it entrenched corporate-friendly, militarized capitalism with wealth accumulation, but it was still very unequal. He pushed for urban renewal and low-income housing, but most of it ended up being top-down, racially discriminatory, and displacement heavy. Signing the Housing Act of 1961, which is funded public housing and urban development projects, but with heavy corporate influence and limited community input. Federal housing policy under JFK reinforced segregation, especially in northern cities, which, if you watch my critical race theory video, you will see. Rhetoric of urban reform masked policies that often favored developers, displaced the poor, and reinforced racial housing programs. Now, as this video is running a little long, let's go ahead and talk about the JFK assassination, the power of myth and misdirection. Basics of this, for those who maybe don't know for some reason, whatever that may be. On November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, while riding in a motorcade. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and accused of the crime, only to be shot and killed 2 days later by club owner Jack Ruby before he could stay trial. The official government investigation, the Warren Commission, concluded that Oswald acted alone, there was no broader conspiracy, and the fatal shots came from the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald also claimed before he was assassinated that he was a patsy, someone who is being framed for the murder. Despite the official story, JFK's assassination gave rise to countless conspiracy theories, including CIA involvement due to JFK's growing skepticism toward covert Operation Post-Bay of Pigs. That's not true, because obviously JFK had no skepticism towards them because Operation Mongoose was in full effect even after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mafia involvement in retaliation for the Kennedy brothers' crackdown on organized crime, also mostly probably not true, because the Mafia, as you see in The Irishman, or read in The Irishman, really were sick of Jimmy Hoffa, and he was the only person with the Teamsters, which was more of an anti-union thing than an anti-Mafia thing. The military-industrial complex supposedly upset over JFK's supposed desire to withdraw from Vietnam, a claim contradicted by his policy choices, which we've talked about ad nauseum. LBJ himself and fringe theories that paint him as a power-hungry and complicit. LBJ could have won the election after Kennedy's administration was over and beaten Richard Nixon without any problem. He didn't need Kennedy to be assassinated. And of course, the second shooter theory from the grassy knoll, immortalized by Oliver Stone's JFK 1991, fueled popular distrust of the official account. So here is the main thing when thinking about the Kennedy assassination. I could go through like I just did and disprove every single theory that there is, because they are very easy to disprove and poke holes through. There's conspiracy theories, very little have any basis in reality, and you can throw a stone and they'll go straight through the paper like it's the Shawshank Redemption. However, as Noam Chomsky put, in Rethinking Camelot and in elsewhere, his interviews, Chomsky has dismissed these theories as irrelevant, stating the one predictable consequence of an assassination was that the policies of Kennedy were pursuing would continue without change. He argues that JFK was not a radical reformer, but a cold warrior committed to defending corporate and imperial interests. The military-industrial complex had no reason to kill him because he was serving their interests just fine. His policies on Vietnam, Cuba, labor, and civil rights were all designed to maintain U.S. dominance and economic stability, not challenge the system. In other words, it doesn't matter who killed him because the system that created him kept marching on. That's the JFK administration. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned some things, and I hope that you have found some things out about yourself. Mahmoud Khalil can still be deported. A judge ruled that on Friday in Louisiana. Israel just recently killed 36 people, all women and children. They often say that men, we acknowledge them as combatants, which I disagree with, but 36 women and children, Israel slaughtered. 15 medics, Palestinian medics, were murdered, and the video is out there if you ever want to watch it. Israel murdered them. They've done this before, but they've done it again. Something has to stop. Please go to the United States Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the first link in the description. Donate, take action, find organizations near you, go yell at your representatives, and stop the genocide in Gaza today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll talk to you guys next time.